So hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you all to this virtual panel presentation and thank you for attending. Our panelists today will be discussing examples from their own work, illustrating the literal and figurative barriers to entry presented at public lands in the past and in the present day. We think the best way to begin that discussion is to literally consider the ground beneath our feet. We want to begin with a land acknowledgement to start the conversation. Our panelists and panel topics are located in different places around the West, but each of us bears a connection to Colorado's public lands, and we'll discuss those spaces in our presentation. That land on which some of us sit today, and which all of us will discuss, is Ute land, Cheyenne land, Arapaho land, Eastern Shoshone land, Puebloan land, and Oceti-Sakowin land. The significance of this land to these nations cannot be overstated, and some of our presenters will address the ways that the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho in particular continue to be active stewards and advocates. A few housekeeping items as we begin. Although we're divided by screens, we hope to create an informal digital experience within this presentation, with plenty of time for questions and discussion. To that end, each of us will be speaking briefly about a project or professional experience that relates to the idea of public land that is, whether de facto or de jure, not created with all members of the public in mind. These topics range pretty widely, so if a question occurs to you throughout the presentation, please feel free to ask these questions in the Zoom Q&A box as it comes to you. We will save those questions to address at the end of the speaking portion. So with that, I'd like to introduce myself and the panel. My name is Poppie Gullett. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently an architectural historian at Pinyon Environmental, where I specialize in Section 106 and preservation planning work. Today, I'll be discussing the history of Pikes Peak National Historic Landmark and the layers of both meaning and management on the mountain. I'm joined by Ariel Schnee, Program Manager at the Public Lands History Center at Colorado State University. She'll be discussing the experience of African Americans and Jews in outdoor recreation spaces, both at Shenandoah National Park and in Colorado's foothills. Next is Jamie Shapiro, Assistant Historian for the Colorado Department of Transportation Region 1, who will discuss a series of projects in Denver's mountain corridors and the way infrastructure projects have historically privileged the leisure of some Coloradans over others. Following Jamie will be Brooke Neely, a faculty member at the Center of the American West at the University of Colorado Boulder. Brooke will be discussing a multi-year collaborative project at Rocky Mountain National Park with Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho focused on expanding and complicating the park's interpretive program to better include Native peoples. Finally, we have Eric Newcomb, Historic Architecture Specialist at the Montana SHPO, who will discuss the public involvement process in developing a management history for El Dorado Canyon State Park near Boulder, Colorado, with an emphasis on the ways the professionalization of history could exclude the general public from its practice. We'd also like to acknowledge our missing member today, Dr. Christina Gish, Associate Professor in the World Languages Culture Department at Iowa State University, who could not join us today. Her work focuses on the relationship between Cheyenne people and their home in the Black Hills, where private property as well as parklands have created boundaries and rules that impose restrictions on the traditional activities of Native people, both for religious purposes and for subsistence activities. She shared her topic outline with us, and Eric Newcomb will be reading her topic outline. So, with that being said, once again, welcome to our panel, and I'd like to hand it over to Ariel to start the discussion.
Amazingly, I remember to unmute myself before speaking, so now that we're all well practiced, it's always feels good. Hi everyone, my name's Ariel Schnee. My research specializes in the intersections between race and environment in public lands, with an emphasis on national parks and state parks as well. First of all, I'd like to thank Poppie Gullett for doing such a fantastic job of organizing this panel and bringing us all together today. Navigating race in public lands is an interesting space to work in. I think because in so many ways the history stands in contradiction to the values and the narratives that most people really consider touchstones and key components of the American public lands experience. I started out looking at a segregated campground in Shenandoah National Park in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. And I was looking particularly at a campground called Lewis Mountain. Lewis Mountain was, I think, a really important place to look because it's one of the rare places on public lands where race was explicitly talked about in terms of racial segregation. If you look at places like Rocky Mountain National Park or the other, significant national parks of the West, those parks were never segregated because they never needed to be. It became a part of the conversation in Shenandoah because Virginia was significant, I think, in terms of how rigidly and how widespread racial segregation was practiced, both in terms of local racial interactions as well as de jure racial regulations, so those enshrined in law. The question of whether or not Shenandoah National Park would be segregated or not was settled very early on, in part because of Virginia's role in amassing the land that became Shenandoah. Shenandoah, unlike the parks of the West, was not created on predominantly federal land. It involved a lot of clearances of the people who lived there, both people who owned the land outright, as well as a group of Appalachian people that had lived on the land for centuries but never had, for example, deeds and never purchased the land outright. So the park was created in a sense out of certain kinds of exclusion, and that remains part of its legacy kind of throughout. One of the really compelling things about Shenandoah is the way in which desegregation failed to fulfill its promises to the African Americans who used it. And in terms of the historical record, during the time of segregation, Black people are more visible in the historical record rather than afterwards. So it was a real struggle to try and piece together why, in spite of desegregation, that moment in time failed to translate into true integration within the bounds of the park. To look at the answer to that, I had to do something very similar when I was looking at racial exclusion in terms of the public lands of the West, which is to look to the gateway towns and to look to the regional and the local culture that surrounded public land, because that matters. The wider context in which these lands exist is extremely significant, because while the park, Shenandoah National Park itself, formally desegregated in 1945, racial segregation in Virginia persists until after the civil rights movement, and local segregation and local racial antipathy persists far longer than that. In terms of Estes Park, which is the gateway town to Rocky Mountain National Park and Grand Lake, you see very similar things happening, where white people are making informal claims to public land and backing that up in some cases in terms of Colorado with violence. The KKK was very active in Colorado in the 1920s and 1930s, notably with the election of Governor Ben Stapleton. And that creates a very difficult environment for people who feel that their safety is compromised when they move through public space. Looking particularly at Denver, the city of Denver attempted to pass residential segregation. There was sort of a de facto black belt that was created in Denver in the Whittier and Five Points neighborhoods. And while those residential segregations were never fully enshrined in law, people did make the attempt, and there was instances of violence against Black people perpetrated by the KKK, both in Denver and across the state. So you can imagine how that would circumscribe free movement and access to public land. So in response to that, there was a development called Lincoln Hills that was established just outside of Denver. It was accessible by both road and rail, which was pretty unique for natural space during that time. And it allowed Black property owners the chance to purchase land in Colorado's mountains for the purposes of recreation. That community was anchored by a building called Winks Lodge, which was a gathering space. And very similar to the way that Lincoln Hills developed, the Jewish organized camping movement in Colorado was very much a response to barriers in terms of access to kosher food, as well as the risk of traveling in places where Jewish people were not welcome. So places that were controlled by the KKK. And also Colorado's tourist industry was also very prone to informal discrimination by both race and ethnicity as well. So that's just sort of an introduction to my research. And now I'll turn it back to Poppie.
Thanks, Ariel. As we go through, we're going to talk sort of project-based. And I think from this point forward, we'll also be presenting slides. So I'll go ahead and share those now. and I'm not sure it's going to let me. There we go. Okay, thanks for your patience, everyone. Are slides showing up on the screen? Well, anyway. I'm seeing some raised hands from the participants. Is that a yes?
We don't see it.
No, okay. Let's try again. Well, I don't necessarily need slides for mine. So what I'll do instead is I'll work on getting those slides for the next presenter and move forward with my presentation.
It looks like the host disabled it somehow. So I don't, if
Oh,
they,
geez. Okay. Well, what I'll do is I will go ahead and give my presentation and we can work towards getting those slides for the next one since they're less important for mine. So I'll go ahead and talk. What I'll be discussing today is Pikes Peak National Historic Landmark, which I think presents an interesting challenge as a historic resource. The peak is layered in a bunch of different meanings and management overlays that build on one another, much like the geological layers that comprise the mountain itself. As a national landmark, the site is managed by the National Park Service. The peak is within Pike San Isabel National Forest, and so it's within the jurisdiction of the United States Forest Service. As a National Register listed site in Colorado, the Colorado SHPO is an official with jurisdiction. In addition to these, the Army maintains the High Altitude Research Laboratory on the peak. And the day-to-day management of recreational facilities at the top is run by the City of Colorado Springs. The overlapping management zones are echoed in the multiple layers of meaning and use on the peak. As I'm going to elaborate on in a moment here, the peak is a sacred site in Southern Ute worldview and across the Ute Nation. It was an important site for exploration through its connection to Zebulon Pike. It served as inspiration for the anthemic America the Beautiful. It's seen nearly a century of use as a tourist site. It houses active utilities from the City of Colorado Springs. The list goes on and on. And today I'm not going to be going necessarily in depth on all of these topics individually, but rather I wanted to touch on how to bring these layers of meaning and historical archival documentation, specifically in the somewhat prescriptive historic American landscape survey process. So let's back up, talk about the general project this work was related to. So I'm a consultant. I was brought on to complete mitigation at the end of a Section 106 review process for the completion of a new visitor center at the top of Pikes Peak. And because I was brought on at the end, I can't offer much detail on how the consultation process went, but my understanding of the project was that the existing visitor center had outlived its usefulness and its expected lifespan. The top of Pikes Peak is a very unforgiving environment for built features, and the 1965 visitor center, built by Carlisle B. Guy, was no longer sufficient to support activity at the top. In addition to the visitor center, the peak is dotted in other buildings, structures, ruins from previous eras of tourism, and a fairly famous cog railway that at the time of my visit was not in operation. Let's walk through some of the layers of meaning in a little more detail here, just at a glance. So Pikes Peak is an ultra-prominent topographic peak in central Colorado. Perhaps due to its commanding presence on the surrounding plains, the peak has gathered stories and served as an important focal point throughout most of its written history. It's been mythologized in a dozen different ways, and perhaps best known to this audience and the American public as the association with the song America the Beautiful. Catherine Lee Bates, who wrote the song, was a visiting teacher at Colorado College in nearby Colorado Springs. She penned the poem after visiting the summit, long before there were drivable roads or amenities at the top. The peak is also deeply connected with the history of exploration in the West. The peak's English name comes from Zebulon Pike, who spotted the peak and recorded it, but never actually summited the mountain. The Southern Ute consider the peak to be sacred. They refer to the peak as Tavakiev, and it's the birthplace of the sun and of the Ute themselves. The Ute are not alone in considering the peak important, and the mountain plays a role in the ceremonial life of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Jicarilla Apache. Pikes Peak is the only mountain in the United States considered a National Historic Landmark. I think that makes it unique and somewhat challenging in and of itself. The view sheds and the intangible nature of the peak are part of the heritage of the entire country. Outside of ceremonial life, there's also practical considerations on the peak. It's currently a grave for 20th century mural painter Carlo Tave. It's a major tourist destination and economic draw for the Pikes Peak region, which is of course named for the peak. And it's the site of ongoing high altitude study. So an additional wrinkle in this process, there's a National Register nomination for Pikes Peak that is on the books, so to speak. The nomination is pretty short, and it's perhaps overly prescriptive in what it considers to be the peak significance. So this makes the 106 process and mitigation process more complicated. The nomination makes little mention of either the long presence of the Ute or the connection to America the Beautiful, instead focusing on Pike. And Morgan has let me know I should be able to share now. Thank you, Morgan. Let's try it one more time. Oh, geez. I'm not seeing it, so. Oh, I believe in myself, though. This is the fun of a live panel. There's always little things that go wrong. All right.
I could share it, Poppie.
Yeah, see if you can give it a shot there. Maybe it's just that I was the host or something. Thank you, perfect. So I'll stop what I was saying real quick and let you know. So on the left there is the Pikes Peak vista looking over Colorado Springs. At the top center is the current visitor center as construction by Carlisle B. Guy. And in the bottom, you can see the no longer in use cog railroad line, ruins in the foreground of the previous tourism site. And in the far background to the left, that's the other side of the existing visitor center. So thank you, Jamie, very much. As I was saying, the National Register nomination has not been updated. It makes little mention of the presence of either the Ute or the connection to America the Beautiful, and instead focuses on Pike, who, as I mentioned, never summited the peak. This early nomination considers the construction of tourism facilities at the peak to be sort of an interruption of the legacy of exploration, which was what was privileged at the time. The 1975 nomination was a reflection of mid-70s attitudes about historic preservation. When the peak was made a National Historic Landmark by administrative action in 1961, which is either the same year or the year after the National Historic Landmark Program was created, there were almost no built features on the summit. And what you can see in that image there in that lower left one at the bottom of the screen, that's the example of the kind of features that were present at the time, for the most part no longer in use and partially ruined. The connection between the peak and the early explorers was prioritized in this first designation, and the summit was treated as an otherwise pristine landscape, with many of the later built features considered intrusive. So how do we address this now that these features have gained significance over time? The Pikes Peak Summit has been reassessed a couple times actually since this original designation. With some greater temporal distance from the mid-century period, a greater value has been placed on the history of tourism and the challenges of providing hospitality in an inhospitable location. To this end, there was a historic district developed in 1998 based around tourism and the cultural importance of tourism on the peak. At the time of recording for this district, once again, many of the buildings were not yet 50, and so were not considered for their place and presence within that district. In addition, there's a greater appreciation now for the place the peak holds in the ceremonial lives of many narratives of Native Americans. The peak is a place of origin for many resident and regional tribes and holds special significance in folklore, history, cosmology, everything. The mountain's multifaceted significance continues to inspire residents and travelers, and I think it likewise inspires more nuanced and careful scholarship with the passage of time. So this is the information I was presented with at the start of the project. So how do I attempt to address these things in something as prescriptive as a Howells report? Well, we knew we would need to address the visitor center with a Historic American Building Survey form, and the steps for working with the builder are pretty clear. But our approach for the intangible element of the peak, as well as its physical reality, was to consider the mountaintop through the lens of the landscape survey. So a landscape survey is a bit newer than their cousins in the building and engineering records, but they still involve a great deal of in-depth research and archival photographs and drafts of drawings. And I've included some of our photographs. These are some of the nearly 40 archival photographs we produced. And our goal in this was to use visual documentation to capture the essence of this very visual resource. One of the first issues the team encountered on this project was that the Howells report we were contracted to complete only calls for 10 photographs. In our opinion, this was not enough to document the entire beauty of the view sheds at top. And we're also trying to provide images that suit the needs of all the different agencies and stakeholders I mentioned earlier. And that presented another challenge. So all in all, we produced almost 40 photographs for the Library of Congress. And I'm aware that if we have archivists in our audience, they may shake their heads at the burden of additional storage, but we felt it was important to be thorough. In addition, the written documentation was more in-depth than the standard Howells short form calls for. And thinking about Pikes Peak as a physical place, we wanted a holistic interpretation of the site. So we consulted geologists, archaeologists, biologists, landscape architects to help describe the physical makeup. We felt it was components of the peak itself, including the rock, the fauna, the use patterns of people, the use patterns of animals that make it part of what it is. And our hope was that in including both that and more emphasis on Ute cosmology and lifeways, we could put those connections on the book, so to speak, for future generations of resource managers. And finally, the drawn component of the port is one of the things I would do differently if I were to go back in time on the project. There's always something to be learned from something like this. And the way we scoped this was with existing surveyor documentation. And if I had the time, I'd go back and have a landscape architect draw it and walk the site with someone who had known it a little better. All in all, this project took almost 3 years from execution of contract to final deliverable. And upon completing my portion, I'm sort of left wondering how we can approach places like Pikes Peak more flexibly while still providing some of the long-term benefits of putting these designations on the books, on the record for formal use in the future. It's not necessarily the place of the consultant to decide something like the creation of a traditional cultural property. I understand that was part of the next steps for the project that we were not part of. But I'm curious if there are better ways to explain and explore intangible heritage that others have encountered. And part of my hope in discussing this here at NCPH is to hear from others of nuanced mitigation documentation ideas or projects that involved intangible heritage in creative ways. So I'll move ahead to, I think we have Jamie next. Jamie, I'll go ahead and keep sharing this. You're sharing the screen, right?
Yeah, I guess I am.
Awesome.
Thanks, Poppie.
Absolutely, thank you.
So my name is Jamie Shapiro. I'm an assistant historian with the Colorado Department of Transportation, CDOT as we go by. And I work in the Denver office in Region 1, so we focus in Denver and the surrounding 7 counties. So I'm going to talk about just sort of 2 highways that are form sort of one corridor from Denver into the mountains, the foothills southwest of Denver, near the town of Morrison, which you may know is the site of Red Rocks Amphitheater. And talk a little bit about the history of those highways, and then the documentation and the present kind of preservation efforts, and then some of the questions that that has brought up for me. So going back to kind of early automobiles in Denver, I was doing some research on the history of these highways, and they go back pretty close to early automobiles. So the first cars in Denver that were advertised were in 1900. They were $750, which is about how much cars cost now, equivalent, about $24,000. They were sold in bike stores, which is interesting. There's some cool photos of that. But in those early days, around 1900 to 1910, when they were becoming popular, there were these automobile clubs. There was the Denver Motor Club. Here's a photo here from the 20s, up one of the highways that I'm going to be talking about. There was the Colorado Automobile Club, and it was really like a recreational activity at that time. There were automobile races. People were driving them up to the mountains. I saw, kind of related to Poppie's, in 1901 was the first time someone drove up to the top of Pikes Peak. So really in like cars that were not advanced at all, not safe. People drove up to Estes Park in 1901, I think. So they were trying to get out, and it was really an instrument of people who had the money and the time to be driving around in these newfangled contraptions and to spend $25,000 on something that was not particularly useful at the time yet, although it was quickly becoming useful. So that's kind of just a little background. And then the Colorado Highway Commission, which became the Department of well, we still have the Highway Commission, but it was kind of the beginnings of what is now the Department of Transportation, started out of the efforts of a lot of these automobile clubs. Don't have time to go into all of that history, but it's kind of interesting. They were really lobbying the Colorado legislature and putting pressure to improve the roads. There were dirt roads that the counties were building. There were city streets, but there was not a unified state highway system. So in 1909, the Highway Commission was formed. And it was really, yeah, so that's kind of important for some of these early highways. Then the first highway that I was working on, kind of documenting this last year, is State Highway 8, originally State Highway 27. Here it is going into the town of Morrison. Basically, this was an important highway around the turn of the century because it linked Denver to the town of Morrison and a lot of the mountains. At that time, there were several ways to go from Denver into the mountains. but not, I mean, there were maybe 3 routes. You could kind of go on US 6 west of Denver. You could go kind of northwest up towards Boulder and Coal Creek Canyon, or you could go southwest on State Highway 8 in Morrison. So this was one of the main routes for Denverites to get into the mountains and into the foothills. And what I found interesting in my research of this highway is it's one of the first highways to be paved. Some sources say that it was the first highway to be paved. Others thought it was maybe the second or third, but it was one of the really early highways to be paved. It was approved to be paved by the Highway Commission in like 1913, and then paved in 1915. So to me, that's interesting because it kind of raises the question of what do we prioritize, or what did we prioritize rather, in transportation? Because this wasn't a route that connected critical economic development sort of assets for Colorado. It wasn't something that connected key communities within Colorado or population centers. It was really a recreation route for people from Denver to get into the foothills. So in my mind, kind of reading back the Highway Commission minutes, it really was a way to allow Denverites to get into the foothills. So then when you kind of read between the lines and thinking about that more, it's like who in Denver was really getting out, who had the time, who could afford a car in 1915, and who would spend a day fishing or going out to the mountains. It's not a stretch to think that this was kind of a project that really benefited certain Coloradans and gave them access to the mountains. So that's interesting to think about. Second highway, if you keep going from Morrison west, this is a different highway, but it's basically the same route, State Highway 74. So I worked on another project here that was doing some historic documentation, working with colleagues of Poppie's at Pinyon, actually. And this is a photo from 1925. And you kind of get the sense, this wasn't, again, this is not a road that connects large population centers. This was one of the roads for kind of leisure and recreation. This road is interesting because it goes back, it was a toll road back in 1873, before Colorado was a state. So it has a long history. Then was kind of fell into disrepair, was flooded several times by Bear Creek on the left. And then really became important during the City Beautiful era for Denver when Mayor Speer had this sort of vision for Denver, and the Denver Mountain Parks was part of that vision. And part of the Denver Mountain Parks plan included these parkways and these highways that were designed by landscape architects. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. actually designed this road and this portion of the park system in, I think, 1914. So there was a lot of effort put in at the city level too by Denver to improve these routes and give access into the foothills along State Highway 74. This route was listed on the National Register in 1990 as a historic roadway. So then jumping into today and kind of the projects that I'm working on. So this route, here's another photo of Red Rocks in the 1920s, which is just off of that highway, a police escort for visiting dignitary, which I think is interesting, kind of symbolically of, you know, who has access and who is important and how we pave the way for them in some cases. So going back to why I got involved with kind of documenting these roads, and the State Highway 74 has a rockfall mitigation project, which was built last summer. But because it's listed on the National Register for Section 106, we went back and kind of were thinking about how can they do rockfall mitigation, which often involves fairly intrusive methods of keeping rocks from falling onto the roadway. As you can see, it's no stretch to see that that is a problem that has caused accidents, is a safety concern. But how can we do that in a way that doesn't harm the historic integrity of this roadway? So we came up with a viewshed analysis tool. We did a whole kind of design charrette process with the engineers, and came up with ways to kind of protect it as a historic resource. But the question there to me is like, first of all, are roads worth protecting as historic resources? Which I think is interesting, and who benefits from this kind of state money being put into preservation? Who are the users of these kind of routes now? I think it's typically the Denver residents who like to hike and run with their dogs and fish. which is a certain class of person, I think, who lives in Denver, which maybe is, that might be half of the people in Denver or something, but it's not everyone. And those are the people that really benefit from all of the time and effort that we put into preserving this kind of resource. And then I think on State Highway 8, there's also questions about, as I was talking about, kind of what the Department of Transportation wants to prioritize, and how can we learn from our own history? Are we thinking about who the users are and who's going to benefit most from our projects? I'm not sure that we are that reflective. I don't think that any state DOTs are probably that reflective, but something to strive for. And also, how does the Section 106 process get shared? Does it just live in, I do these site forms or help do the site forms, and then does it just go into a computer log somewhere and not get shared out? And sharing local history like this is hard. It's hard to make it interesting and to get people engaged. So those are some of the things I was thinking about. And I will pass it on.
Do you want me to just get started, Poppie? Hello, everyone. My name is Brooke Neely, and I am a faculty member at the Center of the American West at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I'm here to share a little bit about a project I've been working on for a number of years now with Rocky Mountain National Park. The project is called Indigenous Connections, and it's a project that brings together representatives from 6 tribal nations, staff from Rocky and the MPS regional office in Lakewood, as well as faculty and students from CU Boulder. And we work with 6 Cheyenne and Arapaho and Ute tribes. And we primarily work with tribal historic preservation offices or cultural offices. Some tribes have TIPO offices and some don't. And then with the Park Service, we're primarily working with interpretation and education staff at the park, as well as some cultural anthropology people in the regional office. And then me and a few others at the university we have played sort of a facilitator role in this project, bringing people together, and I'll describe a little bit more in a moment. The goals of the project have been sort of 3 or 4-fold. We're hoping to generally improve the representation of Indigenous peoples in the parks more generally, and in especially quote unquote nature parks that have a history of erasing and excluding Native peoples. And then we're hoping that park visitors start to visit a place like Rocky, and in addition to enjoying the natural surroundings, have a better sense when they leave of all the people who have had longstanding and contemporary ongoing connections to this region. We're also hoping and work toward supporting tribal connections to this important cultural landscape that includes the park. This has involved talking through visits to the park. There was some planning for that this past summer, which, as you can imagine, didn't happen, but there are ways that they're hoping to bring people and educate their youth in conjunction with the park, and also just to better infuse their knowledge and ways of thinking about the management of the park itself into Rocky's way of doing things. And then lastly, we're just trying to build relationships, which sounds sort of general, but our project has seen that as a really central goal, and that there's a lot of value in forging these relationships between both the tribal partners and the Park Service, but also the folks at the university. And we have some bandwidth and resources that we've been able to bring to bear on it that's been helpful to folks. So just a little background, we started this project in about 2016. We at the university, there were a few folks both at the Center of the American West and the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies at CU that had some informal connections with folks at Rocky, the chief of interpretation, and we met to discuss shared interests, and they were working on a new comprehensive interpretive program and were having trouble engaging some of the tribes who have traditionally had connections there and had worked with the park previously. So they asked if we could help facilitate workshops to engage the tribes at the park. And so we hosted 2 different workshops, one in 2017 and one in 2018. We brought folks, representatives from the Ute Indian tribe in Utah, Southern Ute Mountain, Northern Arapaho, Northern Cheyenne, and Cheyenne Arapaho in Oklahoma, all sent representatives. It started with a formal consultation model. In case anyone's curious about this project, has moved out of the formal consultation mode and is in more of a collaborative mode of working. And that's why we at the university can be involved. But there was initially some formal consultation that happened and an invitation to work on the project. And then at the workshops, we assessed the current park interpretive program, discussed how the tribal partners would like to see changes made. And then the last couple years, and there was discussion of a whole host of things. If anyone's seen the orientation video at Rocky, no one really cares for that a whole lot, but that is a really hard thing to change. And so it became clear that we were going to need to set some other goals in terms of intermediate steps. And so there are new exhibits, videos with tribal members, summer visitor programs, tribal youth visits to the park. All of these things are in the works. But to start off, we have been creating content documents, co-creating them with the university, park folks, and tribal partners for each tribe. And these content documents will be used by park staff to educate new rangers and as they develop new programs and exhibits. We have, over the past few years, we've traveled, both representatives from the park and from CU, to all the tribal offices. We're trying to share the load a bit on travel because most of the tribes are located, their tribal offices are located hundreds of miles from the park itself. And our goals have been, right now, we're finalizing documents that are going to be used for a new ranger orientation this summer. And then new exhibits and things will come from there. And we've been trying to create a collaborative partnership that is definitely a work in progress, but one that, really respects and recognizes the expertise and connections of the tribal nations and the tribal partners, while also actively recognizing how the creation of the national parks was part of dispossessing and forced relocation of Native peoples. And we've had to contend in this particular park, different from some others, for instance, Glacier or a few other parks where they have tribe reservations nearby. This collaboration has to contend with the fact that the relocation was quite far from the park boundaries, and that it has kind of implications in terms of how we work with one another, both in terms of what that means to the tribes and the pain associated with that, but also just logistics and travel. So this project raises all sorts of questions, and I don't have easy answers to any of them. And I'm just going to reflect for a moment, and we can go into more depth in discussion. But there's questions about how can you bring together a federal land agency, tribal nations, and scholars to work together and find common goals. And that little bit of a chuckle, sometimes I laugh, I joke that, bringing NPS, academics, and tribal nations together, what could possibly go wrong? Well, there's a whole history of what has gone wrong in the past. And so we're trying to think about, how can a nature park that's part of the historical erasure of Native peoples be actively involved in sort of repairing or remedying in some way that legacy? And what can NPS and scholars do, or applied academics do to support tribal efforts to connect with ancestral lands? And so this raises, a whole host of issues around erasure and exclusion in US public lands more generally. And our project, we're trying tenuously to address some of that. As I alluded to, tribal nations have long-standing distrust, and as one of our tribal partners used the term heartburn, around US federal government policies and practices, of course, and MPS in particular. We're all in this collaboration, we're all contending with a huge cumbersome federal bureaucracy, including the Park Service folks. And this constrains the work we do and the work they can do and the bandwidth they have for this. TIPO offices and tribal cultural offices have varying degrees of resources and time to devote to something like this, and they get asked over and over and over again for help in this kind of project. So we're contending with that. And then of course, academics, we're trying to tread carefully as we navigate this sort of project. And so there's certainly challenges, and actually, Jamie, you could just show the next slide real quick, I meant to cue you to that, but thank you. Just here's a photo of the workshops and the folks generally who've been involved in this project. And, there are certainly challenges to this sort of work, but we all see great potential in the kind of collaborative project we've created, as long as we continue to take cues from tribal partners as we go, which is, as I said, a work in progress. And we're cautiously optimistic that by changing the interpretive program at Rocky Mountain National Park, then we might move the needle a bit, and MPS could be a bit more inclusive and accessible to a wider public as a result. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, and happy to answer questions later.
And it looks like we do have at least one question on that, Brooke, and I wanted to let the question asker know we've seen your question, and we'll get to that at the Q&A session at the end. So thank you.
Sounds good. I think it's my turn then. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric Newcomb. I'm currently the Historic Architecture Specialist at the Montana State Historic Preservation Office. My job entails architectural review for the Section 106 process and the Montana State Antiquities Act. I also help to facilitate the Historic Tax Credit Program, and I complete some grant management and review. So I wear a couple hats here at SHPO. The project I'm presenting today started near the end of 2019 and continued through the spring of 2020. At the time, I was a graduate research assistant and was hired by the Public Lands History Center at Colorado State University, who contracted with Colorado Parks and Wildlife to write a cultural resource management chapter for the park management plan at El Dorado Canyon State Park near Boulder, Colorado. The goal of this chapter was to provide a practical and useful history of the park that could be utilized by park employees for interpretation purposes of their cultural resources. In addition, the chapter was meant to identify some of those significant cultural resources within the park boundaries and provide recommendations on how to interpret and present those resources to the public and future visitors. Now, unfortunately, the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in March closed several repositories of information that ended up resulting in some delays. But thankfully, I was lucky enough to be able to pass my project off to the very capable hands of Alex Miller at the Public Lands History Center, who was able to complete some research and polish the project as I transitioned here to my new position in Montana. The good news is that some of the research that I was able to do revealed a truly fascinating history at El Dorado Canyon. And I think Ariel can attest to this a little bit. She helped during this project a little bit. What I had thought was going to be a relatively simple history of the canyon ended up being this fascinating history that was truly just very in-depth. Like many other places in the American West, it followed a similar trajectory of a landscape that was defined by labor, beginning with Native Americans and early settlers using the land for agriculture and industry, and eventually transferred to a landscape defined by leisure, in which the land became valued for its natural beauty and accessible leisure activities. The slide on the screen here is one of the first photos we have of the Pruden family, an early settler family in the canyon that established grist mills and sawmills, utilizing both the timber and corn grown to create flour itself. In addition to those early settlers, Native American tribes, including the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribes, made regular pilgrimage to the canyon because of the natural warm springs and used the canyon to grow corn and to graze animals. Eventually, as more settlers experienced the canyon, it started to be valued for its natural beauty as well as its resources. The creation of Craig's Hotel in 1908 at the top of the canyon, linked by the Moffett Road rail line from Denver to Leadville, marks this transition for the canyon from labor to leisure. And Jamie, if you hit the next one, you can see here, this is actually the funicular in the canyon that linked the base of the canyon all the way up to the Crags Hotel, kind of at the peak, that allowed the visitors that stayed at the hotel to go down to the base of the canyon and enjoy the canyon walls itself. This was one of those cultural resources we were able to look at. Unfortunately, the funicular isn't still there, but the remnants of it are, so we could interpret it in that way. Unfortunately for the Crags Hotel, it burned down in just 1912, but fortunately the El Dorado Springs Resort was constructed at the base of the canyon and capitalized on the natural beauty of the high rock walls while offering high-class amenities and entertainment. Jamie, if you could hit the next one, this will show kind of a little bit of that advertisement and what the perception of the resort was at the canyon. Chief among those amenities and entertainment that were offered was the tightrope walker, Ivy Baldwin, who often strung a tightrope between the two large rock faces of the canyon and traversed the 635 feet of space 89 times, with his final journey being in 1948 at the age of 82. After the demise of the resort in the late 30s, the canyon transitioned to a mecca for rock climbing as the sport began to develop and boasted several famous routes up the rock face that are still very well known today. In the 1960s, El Dorado Canyon was one of the top sites in the nation for rock climbing and is still considered to be among the top locations in the present day. In 1978, El Dorado Canyon was sold to the state of Colorado and El Dorado Canyon State Park was founded. In the present day, it still continues to be a destination for rock climbing and other recreational activities enjoyed by visitors far and wide. And thanks, Jamie, you nailed it. This is El Dorado Canyon from looking in the canyon to the east out towards the plains in Colorado. It's truly a beautiful location. Throughout the process of researching this history, the public was an invaluable piece of information to understand this fascinating and complicated place. While there certainly was information in the archives and with the state park resources, I conducted several interviews and phone calls with family members of those who had lived in the canyon, businessmen who continued to have dealings with the springs and water rights, and climbers that continued to use the site in the present day. Their experiences and stories influenced the way in which the history of this place was ultimately told in order to illustrate the complexity of the use of this public land. What I had once thought was going to very simply be this tale of this natural space turned out to have all of these multiple different layers to it that needed to be represented in what was a space that ultimately was now being preserved as one for the public and in its natural beauty. Identifying and understanding the public's perception of the current state park was also essential to selecting which cultural resources within the park needed interpretation and which should have been highlighted in order to illuminate some of the previously forgotten history that informed so much about this place. The reason I highlight this public interaction is because my experience at the State Historic Preservation Office has been a bit different with regards to public interaction on public lands. The formalization of the consultation process between federal agencies that manage public lands eliminates a significant amount of the public involvement in the identification, evaluation, and interpretation of cultural resources. Recordation requirements, argumentative structure, and an ever-increasing desire for efficiency or expediency, depending on who you talk to, continues to limit the ability of cultural resource managers to engage with the public and represents a significant barrier for the general public to engage in the management process. What I had found so valuable in the El Dorado Canyon research project was the public's influence, and yet here at the state level, what I see is an absence of that value, and rather a management from above. As such, I'm curious and have questions about how we can improve that and maybe function for that better in the future. As this panel's talked about ways in which historically the public has been limited to accessing public lands, I think it's also valuable to ask the questions about how our current established processes of identifying, evaluating, recording, and interpreting cultural resources through the National Register and the National Historic Preservation Act continue to limit public involvement as well. How truly involved is the public in this process? How much are they involved in the result? Like Jamie said, where do those Section 106 mitigations and recordations actually go? If the legacy and heritage of public lands is one of exclusion, does our current process break with that legacy or merely represent a continuation of it as we continue to manage these resources? So that's what I've got. I also have the pleasure of getting to read Dr. Christina Gish Hill's statement with regards to her research and her project. Unfortunately, or Christina, I could just call her Christina, I think, was ill and is unable to join us, but she was nice enough to write down her research and her statements. It is written in the first person, so this is her saying it, and I'll try to do it justice. She's far more articulate than I am. Okay. A couple of years ago, I conducted ethnography for the National Park Service with Northern Cheyenne and Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho about Mount Rushmore and tourism and development in the Black Hills. This project sought to understand the concerns Plains people had specifically with Mount Rushmore over representation, desecration of sacred landscapes, and access to those places. One key issue that emerged from the interviews was that development had actually impeded access for Cheyenne and Arapaho people in relation to their sacred landscapes. Private property as well as park lands have created boundaries and rules that impose restrictions on the traditional activities of Native peoples, both for religious purposes and for subsistence activities. A question often posed throughout the ethnographic process was how the Park Service will grant access in the future. For Cheyenne and Arapaho people, access to sacred landscapes is intertwined with concerns over desecration. Preventing desecration to the land in and around the Black Hills for Cheyenne and Arapaho people involves having a seat at the table when decisions are being made about a given landscape. But it also involves being able to maintain an active relationship with a particular place, including carrying out ceremonies. This is not possible without access. Ms. MS stated, "From a Cheyenne worldview, we just inherently belong to that place," referring to the Black Hills, and should be able to practice our relationships responsibly and respectfully in place without having to navigate bureaucratic processes. Ms. LN, a Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho Nation member and veteran, explained that she cannot be a tourist in the hills because they are her home. Ms. Ritchie reiterated this idea, stating that she is not a tourist because this is her land. She continued, "It's a slap in the face for them to take your land and then charge you to come back on it." Richard Littlebear underscored this idea when he stated, "I personally think that Mount Rushmore is a desecration of the mountains themselves because it disturbed a whole bunch of land and it brought in a lot of people that should not have been there." The belief underscoring these statements places human beings in a relationship of responsibility to all the non-human entities that make their home in the Black Hills, including plants, animals, rocks, and spiritual entities. To enter such a space without engaging in such relationships strikes many Cheyenne people as egotistical and foolish. To disrupt the relationships that others have established over generations of careful, patient observation appears dangerous in its potential to lead to destruction for human beings. Several people noted that the earth will survive. It is human beings who put themselves at risk as a result of such behavior. Tourism in the region is intertwined with this type of destructive behavior. Ms. MS ruminated, "I think national parks and monuments regard what are sacred places to indigenous people, including Cheyenne, as tourism, and it's a very capitalistic infrastructure and perspective on land. And I'm not saying that's inherently bad. I'm just saying it takes away the significance of what those places really are, the wisdom and the power. It puts them onto somebody's tour or checklist without really being in that place and without really honoring that place for what it is. For Native people, the power of a place like the Black Hills is inherent." Another way that Cheyenne and Arapaho understandings of land are under attack is through regulation. The Black Hills complex Cheyenne people call home is today divided into multiple boundaries and jurisdictions. The Northern Cheyenne Reservation is in Montana, but Bear Butte and the Black Hills proper are in South Dakota. Bears Lodge or Devil's Tower is in Wyoming, and Fort Robinson is in Nebraska. Fort Robinson and Bear Butte are state parks, whereas Bears Lodge is a national monument. The Black Hills are divided into private, state, and federal lands with differing levels of protections. Ms. MS reminded me that each jurisdiction has the unilateral and arbitrary ability to set priorities without any consultation from the indigenous people who belong to those places. Wallace Bearchum also expressed concern about the legal restrictions that have impacted Cheyenne access to natural resources. He also laid out the very real fear that Native people have of repercussions, legal or otherwise, when he noted, "The history of racism in the state of South Dakota is huge, and for a Native American to be somewhere where they're not supposed to be," he trailed off and paused for a moment, but then stated, "so tensions could escalate." So that also plays into it. I asked him if it felt dangerous to gather culturally required resources, and he said yes. He continued pointing out that this fear is a real barrier for Cheyenne and other Native people to be able to fulfill the responsibilities they have to the land, to the ceremonies, and to their community. He completed his thoughts by noting, "We had access year-round before, but now we're prevented from doing these things by laws and jurisdictions." Mr. RR argued that tribal members have gathering rights through their treaties, including rights to gather endangered species. He stated that Native gathering practices do not endanger plants and pointed out the irony that Native people are prevented from gathering when it is development that is endangering plants in South Dakota. Ms. MS noted how uncomfortable she was with the word access because it implied permission was required to enter a landscape, but she argued that this is another colonial imposition. She also noted that to destructively exploit some land for resources while setting aside other land as a pristine archetype of nature is a very Western Eurocentric action. She pointed out that the underlying assumption of the National Park Service and other US agencies to protect land from humans is really odd from an indigenous or a Cheyenne paradigm, because we do not set parts of ourselves aside from parts of the earth. She explained that people have a responsibility to every place, to every living entity, to ensure the well-being of the entire landscape and all the beings that depend on it. Ms. MS did acknowledge that the Park Service affords specific safeguards for land which are incredibly valuable to Native and non-Native people, but we should not be afraid to question this status quo. Like many of the people I spoke with, she wondered how the Park Service might work with Cheyenne elders to lessen their restrictions without increasing harm to the landscape. Mr. Bearchum stated that an important step towards collaboration would involve working with Cheyenne spiritual leaders to determine if there are sacred sites that need protecting on the property, and to design protocol for retrieving materials necessary for ceremonies and spiritual activities. He also noted that partnering with the Park Service does not solve the problem of access, because once people are allowed to gather, they still have to make the 3 or 4 hour trip, pay for gas and food, and maybe even lodging. The expense is great. Then he noted, "I know we would do it because it's needed for our ceremony." This is a profound sentiment that demonstrates what Cheyenne people are up against when collecting the materials they need to maintain their cultural and religious life. It also reveals their commitment in the face of development, unequal restrictions to access land, and the impacts of environmental degradation. Like I said, she's very eloquent.
So that's the end of what we had prepared to speak about individually. So we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions. Thanks, Eric, for reading for Christina. We have some questions for each other, but we also have some questions from the Q&A. And I'd also like to say thanks to all the Park Service people who looks like are on in the feed loop thing. We're excited to see you, and we're glad you're participating in these discussions. So welcome. So our question, it looks like, is for Brooke specifically. It's from Bruce Noble. He says, regarding Rocky Mountain National Park, it's interesting that there are not resource management people from the park involved in the conversations with the tribes. Traditional knowledge is such a big field. Has there been discussion of involvement from park resource management staff?
Well, actually, there are, maybe I neglected to say it when I was sharing who we work with, but one of the key partners at the park is a cultural resource specialist that does raise a question about why our project doesn't have more natural resource specialists involved. However, our project is one element of the way this particular park engages with and consults with tribes. So we don't encompass all of the work that Rocky does. And in fact, that sometimes is an interesting dynamic as we navigate our project that is considered collaboration. Anytime it veers into formal consultation mode, we at the university are not a part of that. And so so I would say there are resource specialists involved. The key tribal sort of liaison from the park is a cultural resource specialist. And they do a number of other things at the park aside from this project that's focused mostly on interpretation and education. So, and it also, this question raises the issue of the boundaries between cultural and natural resources for sure. And those boundaries are not, that there are bureaucratic boundaries that the tribes don't usually think are very helpful as they navigate working with us. So.
I have a follow-up question to that one actually. For Brooke and then also for the wider group, how does the reputation of Rocky as sort of a nature park maybe change the way that natural resource specialists are assigned to tasks like the one that you're undertaking?
Can you say assigned to tasks like that they would stay in their lane of talking about plants and animals and not necessarily engage with the tribes? Is that what you mean?
Maybe so. I also just, you were talking a little bit about sort of the bureaucratic weight that Park Service employees are often given. And perhaps it has something to do with being a nature park in perception. It has to do with who is invited to these conversations with tribes.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say in some of the consultations, from my understanding, though I'm not always privy to all the details on how the consultations work, they keep some pretty good boundaries on that with us. That there are a wide range of people at the table from the park. So I don't think I think they're depending on the consultation and what the project, what the thing is that they're consulting about, they would have natural resource folks at the table.
Yeah, and Brooke, I think it's been interesting to hear you talk about moving backwards and forwards in between formal consultation and this kind of informal collaboration. Do you have a sense of if one is more productive than the other, or what some of the hindrances maybe of either process might be?
That's a big, good question. And I'm sure the park folks who are in the audience have even more insight in this. We've heard a number of times from park folks that they like the idea of that they're not just doing consultation, they're not just checking a box, that they want to have real collaboration, whatever, when we get into what real collaboration means. At the same time, there's also wariness. Some of our tribal partners have asked, why are you at the university involved in this? And there's concern about who are they engaging with? Are they engaging with the top level folks at the leadership at the parks? And so there's all sorts of questions that come up around consultation versus collaboration. We've tried to move in a direction where it involves ongoing connection and co-working and, taking the time to really work together, but which sometimes has not been seen as the way consultation works, but that's a big conversation.
I think it's kind of interesting because formal consultation can often provide a little bit of structure and weight of law, essentially, when it comes to resolving some of these questions, but it often, as you said, excludes certain parties like universities or others that have valuable information in understanding what this resource is, and Native peoples as well. And so I think it's interesting to think about what's more valuable to be within that structured consultation process that allows for some of those dialogues to occur, or having an informal collaboration where truly everyone has a seat at the table and all those perspectives are represented, but doesn't necessarily resolve sort of the bureaucratic legal question with regards to the process.
We just got a pretty good comment from Kimberly Selinsky. Thanks for participating on Feedloop. We appreciate it. They state informal collaboration can be faster, but also ask for extra labor from people who are not getting paid or compensated. I don't know if you guys have examples of that in the sorts of collaboration and consultation you've completed.
Is that for Eric or me?
I think it's for the whole group.
Yeah, what other folks?
I was going to say, not to speak for Christina, but she mentions that directly in what she has to say about working with the Cheyenne and Arapaho, that they have to incur all these extra costs to go to these places they traditionally would have simply been allowed to walk onto and been part of from the get-go. And Brooke, earlier you mentioned that your collaborative partners are farther away from Rocky than removal moved them further. And that does require additional financial and time labor from these people.
Yeah, I can also jump in to say that with the work that the Public Lands History Center, the organization that I assist to run, what it took to find ways to support that kind of necessary work that often either goes overlooked or uncompensated was actually to find private grant funding, private foundation funding, because that was the mechanism that allowed us the flexibility to actually compensate people for their time to speak to us. So one of the projects that we're running under that grant, and unfortunately it wasn't one that I had time to speak about today, but it involves doing oral histories with the Autumn, which are the indigenous group that lives at the US-Mexico border. But yeah, we had to write that into our grant in order to be able to compensate the people who, would drive a couple of hours to come see us, and also build in funding to support travel, both to CSU as well as to Ajo, which is the city kind of closest to their ancestral lands and where many of those folks live. So yeah, it takes flexible funding. And I think that in the future, more granting organizations should maybe contemplate how we can create more opportunities for funding flexibility that doesn't restrict those kinds of costs.
Yeah, because I think there's something to be said there about some of that informal work that goes uncompensated. And Brooke, I think you touched on it, and particularly when you said that relationship building is such an integral piece to moving the process forward. And so much of that is not necessarily compensated or can't necessarily be compensated through the formal consultation process. That's a humongous piece of it, especially when dealing with Native groups and some of that, I love the term, the heartburn of dealing with federal agencies, amongst others.
Yeah, I didn't get to get into this, but we've received funds. The CU Boulder Outreach Office has a grant that we've received multiple years for. It's not huge, but it has supported travel, and they support the relationship building piece. So like Ariel said, just identifying the funders that might help support that sort of work. And then we also have gotten funds from the Rocky Mountain Conservancy, which is the friend organization of the park. So that's an interesting, any of these public land entities, sometimes they have nonprofit funding arms that you could explore as well. But.
It came at a follow-up note. And then I think we'll ask each other some additional topics, and please keep adding your topics into our Q&A or on FeedLoop. Thank you for being an active listener as well. Formal consultation can be compensated for sure, but getting funding for more informal work has been especially difficult within tribes that are not nationally recognized, which is not something we especially talked about in our work here, but they do live on the lands we live on. And so I think that's an important note as well, is that some of this is dependent, and so many things are dependent upon formal recognition through the federal tribal enrollment system. So thank you. That's an excellent addition and comment. Looks like we have another Q&A question from Abby Courier, she, her, thank you. For the academics in the group, how did you find these projects? Did you go out and seek them, or did these groups reach out to you for support?
Well, for the Shenandoah project, we're lucky at the Public Lands History Center that we actually had an alumni who was working cultural resources at Shenandoah, who was aware of the center and has connections to the principal investigators. So she reached out to us with the offer of that project, and it was funded through a National Park Service task agreement. For the other research that focused on Colorado and Denver, that was unfunded. It was an invitation to do research associated with camping in Colorado from our State Historical Association. And that was work that the Public Lands History Center was happy for me to do pro bono. And for that grant that I mentioned, we were invited to apply for that grant. It was kismet as much as anything else. They say that like overnight success takes 10 years, and I think that's accurate. We actually just had our 10th anniversary when that funding opportunity kind of found us. Yeah, the vice president of the Granting Association was in the area for a different reason, found us online and decided to reach out to our director. We had a chance to meet with him, and then he invited us to apply for that grant, and luckily we got funded.
Who else would be considered? Am I the other one who would be, since Christina's not here? So our project, we've often heard from Park Service folks that we have a sort of different model than a lot of the ways the academics, and Christina is an example of this. I know her work well because we're collaborators. There are often open calls for what they call CESU contracted research. And many of the academic collaborations that happen, sometimes it's just one-off research reports, sometimes there's more involved. They often come through those channels of sort of contracted out research. Ours didn't, because there was sort of informal networking and connections and conversations that developed, and sort of a plan emerged sort of organically from there. So it was more shared interests around public lands in the West and inclusion and Native peoples, and with some relationships we already had with folks at Rocky, and then things built from there.
And Eric, I would even say that the Eldo Canyon was an academic example of a project.
Yeah, and that was certainly as a result of my position as a graduate teaching assistant and my affiliation with the Public Lands History Center that was able to contract through that. But I think if people are, if there are people that are looking for this work, searching out the State Historic Preservation Office is a great way to see kind of what the needs are out there. They may not be able to fund the project, but it's a great way to recognize where some of the needs are and to trace down those elements. Because yeah, going kind of at it as in a shotgun approach can be difficult for sure, but there's always need for people willing to do this type of work.
So it looks like we have another question from Julie Peterson. Hi, Julie, it's good to hear from you. A PLHC alum herself. You all talked about access to public lands being somewhat of a dichotomy between labor and natural resources and leisure. Can you talk a bit more about the multiple stakeholders involved in some of these projects? I'm curious about the multiple uses of these lands impact how they were used today and how we interpret their past. So thinking about the dichotomy between labor and leisure, and these multiple stakeholders and what they have to say on those topics. That's a big one, but I'll open the floor.
At Shenandoah, labor was really interesting because it didn't just go away with the creation of the park. I think it's more of a question of seeing the labor that allows others' leisure to happen. For example, at Lewis Mountain, the concessionaire that the park contracted with to provide those services, the Virginia Skyline Company, employed several people to run the lodge at Lewis Mountain. And this was a full service housing and dining and facilities kind of position. That was originally held by a white couple. And then when they moved on, the company found a Black gentleman and his wife, the family name is Tutt, T-U-T-T, to run that lodge. And it's interesting the ways in which that labor figured within the Black community, and especially the local Black usage of that area, because Tutt was a community member in Luray and had family and friends in the area. So it almost became like a community center of sorts, where they established very specific kinds of use and ownership. So the oral histories on that place are really interesting. They're dominated by memories of home cooked food that people claimed were the best that you could find anywhere in the park. Music, dancing, games of ping pong on the porch, the campground and the area surrounding Lewis Mountain held meetings of the New York Virginia Society, in which people would kind of have an annual homecoming. Folks who had kind of been involved in the Great Migration North would come home once a year, and then they would have these hundreds of people picnics. It also hosted events from Howard University that would sometimes involve hundreds of students. So it's interesting the ways in which Lewis Mountain specifically sort of like bridged labor and leisure in interesting ways. And the ways in which laboring actually provided a kind of privileged access for other people There's also a really amazing anecdote where there's a fire road that comes by the lodge, and that gate is locked, but according to local lore, pretty much every person in town had a key to that gate.
Kind of on a similar vein for the Pikes Peak part of the project. So I didn't really get into it in the short summary I wanted to give, but there is a history of extractive industry on Pikes Peak that is also sort of its own can of worms, interesting past. And this is also one of those things that the stakeholders didn't necessarily want us to talk about so much. The labor of tourism, of creating hospitable spaces, that was really brought forward, but that history of mining and extractive industry, not so much. So I thought that was interesting what kinds of labor that people were more interested in discussing and putting, like, as I said, probably too many times in the presentation, on the books. But it's interesting the kinds of things those stakeholders, who are all land management agencies for the most part, interested in tourism, interested in bringing those things to the forefront, asked us to focus on in a way we approach this resource. And as I said before, there was an entire HABS documentation created about just the visitor center itself, and then talking about the different buildings and ruins and other ways of getting people to the top. So that got quite a lot of press time. These other kinds of labor happening on the peak, whether they include the small utilities creation facility, the high altitude research lab, which is a form of labor. There's all sorts of other strange things related to the peak, like fighter jet testing that happened up there that I didn't get into, all sorts of strange things that are sort of one-off and spun off into the distance, but they don't necessarily coalesce into a narrative in the same way that the labor of creating tourist spaces does. So I thought that was a really interesting way that maybe these management agencies hadn't really thought about the other kinds of labor happening, but they did want to explore something that related directly to their mission.
Yeah, I think Poppie and Ariel have kind of hit the nail on the head here, that dichotomy between labor and leisure, while it's really easy to draw a line in between the two, is really a balance, especially throughout the history of El Dorado Canyon. That the early labor associated with the agricultural history is very evident in the growing and the grist mill and, you know, those elements of it. But as it shifted to this landscape of leisure, it doesn't mean that there was an absence of labor, but just rather a change in the types of labor that was done in order to support that leisure that was there. And so while it may not have been the exploitative labor of using the natural resources of the canyon, there still was the required upkeep of the resorts themselves, the transportation of people into this space in order to enjoy the natural beauty and to create those sorts of transportation devices that were necessary to enter the canyon and enjoy it in and of itself. And so I think it's valuable to think of that labor-leisure dichotomy more as a balancing act in between the two, as opposed to this, you know, light switch that goes from one to the other, even though we'd like it that way. And I think it's something to be said about the continued state management of parks, or even of national parks itself, that in and of itself is a form of labor devoted to allowing public access and leisure to these spaces that are meant to be, quote unquote, pristine.
Eric, Julie has a follow-up question specifically related to you, if you don't mind. She says, thanks, Ariel, that's very interesting. I'm also curious about the El Dorado Canyon example regarding historic agricultural use and contemporary use as recreation for climbers and hikers.
Yeah, and I think I kind of touched on that a little bit, but the agricultural use was quite limited to the early settlers in particular. With the establishment of the Crags Hotel in 1908, things really shifted towards a tourism and leisure aspect from there. I don't necessarily know that there were any additional historic agriculture once that sort of banked goes down, you know, takes that turn in the narrative. And I think it's interesting to think of the preservation of the space for hikers and climbers in particular, and what labor is associated with that. It certainly isn't the same, but like I said, it still is present.
It sounds like we've got a related question to Julie's from Anne Mitchell-Wisnot. I'm sorry if I butchered your last name. Sorry about that. But Dr. Wisnot says, related to Julie's question, I'd love to hear y'all talk more about the dichotomy between some kind of notion between a public good, in quotes, that underlies creation and maintenance of public lands and public roads, and the exclusivity or differential benefits baked into almost all park road or road projects. how do we deal with the tensions between these two things? And do or can we articulate a general public good that these entities serve? Jamie, I think this kind of gets into questions you were asking at the end of your presentation.
Yeah, I could start. I have some thoughts. I mean, that's a big question. One thing that I learned in my research of State Highway 8 that was interesting, that sparked me wanting to learn more about this in other roadways, is the contractor who first paved it. His brother was on the Highway Commission. I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, and then later became the Highway Commissioner. And it was his contracting company that got the contract to pave that. And I'm just curious how many more of those stories are in CDOT and other public agencies' histories of. So that's a case of like where someone benefited directly from the public good. But I think in any, like, I mean, this is not historical, but thinking about the infrastructure bills that are coming and all of the infrastructure spending that's incoming, like any kind of large spending like that, there's going to be people that make a lot of money too. So anytime it just makes me think, we're against CDOT too, anytime there's a public investment, there is a public good, obviously, and we all need roads, and we all order things probably from the internet, which require roads. So that's a public good, and it's how we get our groceries and everything like that. But there are also people making money from building those resources, and they're for-profit engineers and construction companies that are, multinational in many cases, that are doing that work. So that's an interesting question, I think, and I think we could document that history better. My thought.
Yeah, because there is a democratizing element to the construction of roads just by the fact that it allows for easier access to some of these places in an easier format. And so while that can still allow for that differential between who can actually use the roads, it ultimately provides greater access, right? I mean, we could all agree on that. But yeah, it's hard to.
Ooh, can I interject? Because I totally hear what you're saying, Eric, but remember what you read from Christina, that the very development of the Black Hills for the Cheyenne, their perspective is that even the creation of roads, which is interesting because I did research in the Black Hills as well, and people would talk about just seeing paved roads there. Tribal Lakota folks or other Native people see it as painful, feel pain when they see a paved road, not to mention a mountain carving, but so it feels kind of so connected to access, and yet there's implications there.
Yeah, because I mean, those different stakeholders are going to definitely view that very differently, right? Those Native perspectives are going to see that road as destructive of that space, where others will see that as the ability to enjoy that space easier and for the common good. So I think there's that balancing in between, you're looking at the greatest good or the largest audience or the specific perspectives. Absolutely.
And I should say there's not universal opinions. Like when I was there, I had a few Lakota pals who were really into Sturgis and riding their Harleys around the small roads in the Black Hills. So all of that to say, it's of course varies depending on people's perspectives and experiences. So.
We actually had a question come in on the chat from Abby Courier, and she, I think, asks a very related question, which is, but can't adding roads also be problematic, especially when it cuts through communities that were not consulted or were possibly pushed out of the way? And I would expand that to say that it's not even just roads. I think if you start looking at the history of the national parks, particularly Shenandoah, that land was very thickly populated, and those people all had to be removed somewhere. To some extent, those folks were relocated from mountains into valley properties that were not culturally related to them. And then also in terms of Rocky Mountain National Park, come Mission 66, the park gets very aggressive about buying out inholdings and seeking to eliminate those, as well as not even just seeking to push people out, but also just seeking to remove any evidence of inhabitation from the park in an effort to rewild things.
And I would push it even further from reading Christina's work when she noted that the simple delineations of different state lines, posed an issue for Native groups that are tied to the land as opposed to the management of that land, and recognizing that assigning different parcels of land to federal agencies to manage that can have a benefit because there's active management there, but carving up the land in that way doesn't necessarily make sense in looking at the land as a whole. So I agree with Abby. There's definitely problems in both perspectives, right? And whether or not the intention is for the public good, yeah, that's a rough question to answer.
Well, we're down to about 2 minutes left on our panel. We have time for one more question, but I wanted to thank everyone so much for being active participants. We'd love to get questions that, 5 minutes remaining. I've got 2 minutes on my clock. Thank you, Morgan. We have time for maybe 2 questions then. So if you have them, please bring them in. But thank you all so far for being so active. I really appreciate it. I've got questions that we can ask each other as well if we want to spend a little time on that. There's some topics we all noticed and sort of in common that we wanted a chance to explore. One that sort of kind of is near and dear to my heart is the presence of mountain landscapes in all of our work. I wanted to talk a little bit about how all or most of our topics engage kind of specifically with mountain landscapes over other kinds of public lands. And I'm curious if we all think there's a relationship between mountains, which can sometimes be a natural barrier, or other kinds of creative barriers. So if you guys want to dig into that one, if you have thoughts on the way mountains are barriers and also how we have to create access to these barriered spaces, dig in. Or I can leave.
Yeah, I think that the Denver mountain parks are really interesting. There's a really interesting history. Supposedly, yeah, one of the first kind of municipally owned mountain park systems where the city bought land. And then there were these roadways and highways that were built very intentionally and designed by a landscape architect to reach them. But there is a certain like access constraint, I think, naturally when you look at the history of who was using them and who went up there, just given the distance and there's like a perception of the difficulty of driving in the mountains maybe, or whatever kind of the barriers are. I mean, I think that's still, it still comes through very much in Colorado. There's the people that, there's levels of outdoor access among different communities. And I think that was very true when I was looking at State Highway 74 and access to those mountain parks.
One of the things that I find really interesting is the ways in which the decisions to prioritize roads and cars over other kinds of transportation in the mountains affects who's there. Because as I mentioned before, Lincoln Hills was accessible by rail from Denver. And I think Eric mentioned also that rail was extremely important to El Dorado Springs. Neither of those are transportation options to those areas currently.
Well, I felt like I noticed something sort of similar on Pikes Peak. Jamie mentioned in his presentation, it was, very early cars were going up to the peak in 1901 or 1902, something very, very early in the creation of automobiles, and how that has been pretty integral ever since then. And something unique about when I was up at the peak was the cog railway, which is typically how people who don't have access to a good mountain driving car get up there, was down. And that really additionally limited the amount of people who can go up there. Another access issue for Pikes Peak is that it is very high, and it can very quickly cause altitude sickness for people who visit who are not prepared. I got sick while I was up there, but I was up there for almost 10 hours, and I don't think that is what you're supposed to do. That's not exactly acclimating correctly. So there's also elements of literally these things are hard to get to. And so how do we sort of condense the difficulty of letting people visit these spaces and see these beautiful vistas when they're inherently inhospitable to people? And I think that's a unique thing with especially high mountains, but also recreating in mountains can be kind of dangerous. Not to ramble on that too long, but also this continues, I think, having the appropriate kind of car to access the mountains makes this sort of a class issue, and it continues to be a class issue. If you can't afford snow tires, if you can't afford certain things that you're going to need to drive on ice, that can also create additional barriers to access for people. So additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, and the possibility of requiring electric-only vehicles in national parks to protect the airspace could be another extension of that clash issue as we move forward as well. I know Zion already has the bus system, but other parks in Utah are considering implementing that rule for those parks that are drivable.
Julie provides an interesting comment on this one. It's interesting you're focusing on mountains as barriers, but it also seems mountains are also crucial to the appeal of these places visually and culturally. Like that's true. And I think that's part of why there is even an impetus at all to create access to these spaces. If they weren't visually or culturally interesting, how much of what we discussed today would even have happened? There is something sort of inherent in the draw of these spaces for sure.
And it's so linked to citizenship in America, and I think to Western identity as well. While I didn't have a ton of opportunity to talk about the research that I did on Jewish summer camps, there's a reason why these places are located in the mountains. Camp Schwader is located at the base of Mount Evans, and the J-Bar CC ranch camp is located in the Black Forest near Colorado Springs. So these places and establishing these places where they were was very important, not only because they offered awesome recreational opportunities, but also because it's a very clear assertion that these people who get left out of kind of the general access to public spaces manage to establish themselves in the mountains specifically.
It creates a sense of belonging in a way that other groups don't even think about.
And ownership. I mean, in explicit terms, you have to own land because you are not included in the public ownership or the ways that people conceive of public ownership on public lands.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll probably have to close the Q&A here, but Bruce had one last comment. We really don't we really don't want to provide access to every place, he says. Look at Alaska. If there was access to every place in Alaska, the entire character of the place would change. And I think that's exactly right. And that is sort of what we've all kind of talked about as well, is that the character of these places change over time based on access. So I think almost that's a great note to end on. So once again, thank you all. I also wanted to thank Morgan Morant. Thank you for being our tech person and getting everything fixed, especially fixing the SlideShare. We super appreciate that. And then I want to thank Caridad de la Vega, National Park Service, but also sort of shepherding the people on the feed loop portion of this. Thank you, Caridad. And then if anyone has anything else to share, I think we're just about to wrap up.
Thank you so much, Poppie.
Sounds good. Yeah, thanks, Poppie, for organizing everything.
Thanks, Poppie.
Thanks everyone for participating, and thank you participants for coming.
Thank you all.